If they don't get that money, then the front lines collapse. What happens if the front lines collapse? Russia pours across the borders in Ukraine further. What happens to the people of Ukraine? You end up with a massive refugee crisis. 20 million Ukrainians will pour into Europe. What happens next? Russia occupies a large part of Ukraine. And by the way, what do they get when they're occupying a large part of Ukraine? They get all the materials that we've supplied, all the equipment. They also get all the Ukrainian soldiers because they get forced, sort of frog marched into battle on behalf of Russia.
So, Bill Browder, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Great to be here.
We've got to start off with what happened yesterday, which was Vladimir Putin. He was making a TV address to Russians. He said that the goal of the special military operation will be achieved unconditionally. He said that if Ukraine don't want to have a substantive discussion, then Russia will liberate its historical lands on the battlefield. So, I mean, Bill, is that enough proof for Donald Trump, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, that Putin and his army have no plans to slow down, no plans for peace, no desire for peace, no desire to make concessions, and will continue their military operation until all of Ukraine is theirs?
I think the one, Vladimir Putin is a big liar. He lies all the time. That's his stock in trade. But the surprisingly honest thing he's been doing is being very consistent when it comes to his goals in Ukraine. He started this war saying that he had these maximalist goals of basically taking over Ukraine. And he's repeated it pretty much every single day for 4 years. And he repeated it again yesterday, and he continues to repeat it. And so the people who somehow think that there is some compromise he's willing to reach or that he's willing to negotiate just aren't paying attention. There is no chance that he is going to negotiate, that he's going to compromise, and there's no chance that he's going to agree to any type of situation except a situation in which he can achieve his maximalist objectives.
So when we see Putin openly making a recorded TV address, not holding back, how do you think this makes Trump and his inner circle look?
Well, I mean, I think that they have various ambitions and goals, mostly business goals, which they're trying to achieve. And from their perspective, they don't really care what the settlement looks like. They want some kind of settlement so they can do business with Russia. And so if Putin puts out these goals, these maximalist goals, I suspect that Donald Trump will go back to the Ukrainians and say, well, you're troublemakers. You're not agreeing to these maximalist goals. We want to do our business. There's a lot of deals we want to do, and you're getting in the way of these deals, and that's really making me mad. And then Trump will say to Zelenskyy, you shouldn't have started this war in the first place. I mean, the whole thing is Alice in Wonderland. It's crazy. It's insane. We all have, memories and eyes and brains. We've all seen what happened. To watch this thing playing out in which Donald Trump is blaming the Ukrainians, getting mad at the Ukrainians, and then getting mad at the Ukrainians for not letting him and his pals do business with Russia is infuriating beyond belief.
Before we get into what a pivotal day today will be in Brussels, I want to stick on what's happening with this speech Vladimir Putin made. So in response to Europe's fears that Russia will invade another sovereign country and has plans for expansionism outside of Ukraine, he said that I have said many times this is a lie, nonsense, just nonsense about some imaginary Russian threat to European countries. European politicians are deliberately stoking the level of hysteria. So, I mean, is Putin legitimately trying to gaslight European leaders into believing that he just wants Ukraine?
Well, I mean, European leaders, a lot of the same European leaders were those people who traveled to Russia in January of 2022 and said, you've amassed a bunch of troops on the border of Ukraine, don't invade. And he said, that's outrageous. We have no intention of invading. These are military exercises. That would never happen. That's scaremongering. And of course, a month later, he invaded. And so Vladimir Putin can't be trusted. He's a pathological liar. And it's obvious to everybody with what he's doing right now that he intends to continue at war not just with Ukraine, but with a hybrid war with Europe. He's been at a hybrid war with Europe. They've been digging up internet cables under the Baltic Sea. They've been sending out military drones into Poland, fighter jets into Estonia, assassins into various European countries. This is a war, a hybrid war that's already started. And for anyone to believe Putin based on all of the false statements he's made before would be a horrible, dangerous existential mistake.
Not only that, Bill, but in the same address, he said that by the end of this year, the new medium-range missile system with hypersonic missile Oreshnik will be put on combat duty and it will be deployed to Belarus, which of course borders Ukraine and other NATO countries.
Yeah, well, I guess that in a certain way contradicts his previous statement that he doesn't want to go to war with Europe. But the one thing I can say is that the most recent missile test that Putin did was very reassuring. The missile went up a few seconds and then went back down and exploded in midair. I mean, Putin has a lot of nuclear weapons. He's got a lot of conventional weapons. Some of them work, some of them don't work. He could do an enormous amount of harm to the rest of the world. But he also understands that he's living in a world of mutually assured destruction. And so I seriously doubt that he's going to launch any type of nuclear attack on the West, because if he does, then a similar thing will happen back towards him. But for him to be talking about his or placing and then talking about his hypersonic missiles doesn't do a lot to alleviate the justified and clear understanding that he's not stopping. He will be at war with whoever he needs to be at war with, and he needs a war. Vladimir Putin needs a war to stay in power. He needs a foreign enemy. He can't just end the war in Ukraine and say, okay, back to business. We're just going to focus on internal matters. If he did that, then people in Russia would say, well, why are we so poor? You know, you've been in power for 25 years. Why do we not have paved roads? Why is there no medicine in the hospitals? Why are there no teachers in the schools? And then they would say, oh, that's because you're a bad guy. You're the president. You've impoverished us. We don't like you. We want you gone. And even if it's not a democracy, if 1 million people march on Red Square, they'll hang Putin from the lamppost, as many other dictatorships have done to their dictators when the pressure gets too high. Putin understands this. He needs to make sure that doesn't happen. How do you make sure it doesn't happen? You have to have somebody else to be mad at. And it's either Ukraine, it's Europe, it's whomever, so that the Russian people in a nationalist fury are looking outside instead of looking inside to see who their enemy is.
I want to get your reaction to a few of the other things he said in this TV address, because there was so many viral quotes from Putin. He really didn't hold back. So one of the things he said was that after the Soviet Union collapsed, we believed that we would quickly join civilized Western world. Today, it seems that there is no civilization, there only degradation. He also said that we did not start the war in 2022. In essence, the West itself unleashed this war. So is he trying to convince his own people of this, or is he trying to convince himself?
Well, I mean, it's kind of like trolling. It's the same type of thing that you might see on Twitter, which is now known as X, where somebody puts out an alternative viewpoint. It's an alternative viewpoint that doesn't have any connection to reality. But there are people out there that will believe that or people who want to believe that. And probably his audience is the MAGA group inside the United States, who can then repeat and chant these same talking points. But the fact of the matter is that he's correct. He didn't start the war in 2022. He started the war in 2014. There was no Russian-backed separatists in Ukraine. This was a Russian invasion when they took Crimea. It was a Russian invasion when they went into eastern Ukraine in 2014. They were at war for a long time on a slow burn, and then they ramped it up dramatically in February 2022 with a massive invasion. Everybody can see that. There's no mystery to that. It's not like you have to go into some reference book to find that. Everybody has watched that. Unless you were born yesterday, that's what happened. And so for him to say that, it only works with very uneducated people who are sort of biased towards those talking points, and it doesn't do any good anywhere else.
Vladimir Zelenskyy responded to Putin's TV address with a tweet. He said, "Today we again heard signals from Moscow that they are preparing to make next year a war make next year a year of war. So these signals, not only for us, it is crucial that our partners see them, and not only see them, but also respond, especially partners in the US who often say that Russia wants to end the war. So, Bill, is Zelenskyy sending a strong message to the United States there to open their eyes?
Well, I would say he's kind of begging the United States to open their eyes, begging Trump to be reasonable here. I mean, we're in a very, very precarious moment because Trump is trying to force an unreasonable deal on Ukraine, in which Ukraine has to give up territory that Russia hasn't already won on the battlefield and can't win on the battlefield. It's trying to force Ukraine into a situation where they can be reinvaded at a moment's notice with flimsy, quote, security guarantees, which they can't rely on. And Ukraine doesn't have the resources to continue fighting back because the U.S. has stopped supplying financial and military aid to Ukraine. And so Trump is trying to force Ukraine into a really ugly, terrible, sovereignty destroying decision. And there's only one way out of this, which is if Ukraine were to get the money that's been frozen in the West. And Trump is also pressuring European countries to try to stop that money from going to Ukraine so he can force through this completely unreasonable proposal.
And we'll get into the money in a minute, but I want to get your thoughts on the fact that earlier in the week we saw reports that the US had offered Ukraine Article 5 style security guarantees, a compromise because Ukraine has said that they won't join NATO in as their own concession, but they do need Article 5 like protection. This is, of course, as part of the broader push to negotiate the end of the war. So the proposal is framed as time limited, with the US officials signaling that the offer won't remain on the table indefinitely, increasing a lot of pressure for Kyiv to engage on this quickly. So we know that European leaders have offered their own security guarantees, Bill, but what did you make of the United States' offer?
Well, I don't know the details of their offer, but from what I can tell, most people don't believe it's a sincere offer. We've seen that Trump has flip-flopped on his offers. His security guarantee from Donald Trump is probably not worth the paper it's printed on. And so it's a very fraught situation because Ukraine is holding Russia back right now. It costs money and resources to hold Russia back. Russia hasn't made any real progress in the last year or last 2 years. In fact, since the war began, they've more or less not made any real progress. But they will make progress if all of a sudden there's no more resources for Ukraine, and Ukraine is running out of bullets, and that's kind of where we are today.
We've seen a lot of division within the Republican Party over how Trump and his inner circle have handled these negotiations and handled Putin and spoke about Putin in the public eye. So last week we saw Ben Shapiro. He said this on his show. He said that the notion that we somehow hold more in common with Vladimir Putin than we do with the Europeans is nonsense. It is not true. We hold virtually nothing in common with Vladimir Putin. So even staunch Trump reporters, Bill, aren't happy with this level of weakness.
Yeah, well, it's inconsistent with the American public opinion, which then leads everybody to the question: if Americans and Republicans specifically, are on the side of Ukraine and aren't on the side of Vladimir Putin and haven't ever been, why is Trump deviating from that? And I've always learned from as an investor, because that was my main occupation before becoming a human rights activist, that if something doesn't make sense on the surface, it's not because someone's behaving irrationally. It's just we don't have all the information. But we're starting to get the information. There was a Wall Street Journal article about a month ago which laid out that there was a whole bunch of business deals for people close to President Trump. And so it looks like there is some kind of financial incentive for them to go against American public opinion. That's the only thing that could explain this sort of irrational, what appears to be irrational behavior.
But if this is about pursuing future business deals, brokering trade investments between the two countries, or if it's more so about individuals when the war is over, does the US and these American individuals get enough out of it if it's purely about investment and business deals? Because is Russia a prosperous enough country, or will it become a prosperous enough country for foreign investments? Or are the days of booming foreign investments in Russia over, the days when you were there, Bill, in the early 2000s?
Russia's an uninvestable country. There's no business. Nobody's going to make any money in Russia, with a perhaps one very big exception, which is perhaps there'll be some type of financial inducement for Donald Trump or his family or somebody very close to his family to do this, because no one else is going to make any money out of this thing.
So the country of America will not make any money out of any investment in Russia.
Without question, there will be no Americans other than one or two who will make money out of this deal.
So Bloomberg is reporting that the White House is preparing a plan B in case Russia rejects the US brokered peace deal. So the plan reportedly involves a new round of sanctions targeting Russia's shadow fleet vessels, the traders involved in that, and of course the energy sector. So Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, he responded saying it's explicitly false to conclude any decisions have been made regarding future sanctions against Russia. But sanctions threats from the US side happen every time Putin refuses to make a concession or come to the negotiating table. But now would be the time, as we're heading deep into the winter months, to slap further crippling sanctions on Russia. Do you see that happening?
Well, we've been here so many times before. I think this might be the 11th time that sanctions have been threatened and then not followed through. And I would urge everybody to look at the small print of that, because I read that yesterday and looked at the small print, and they're talking about doing something which really has no impact, which is sanctioning a bunch of rusting ships. The original plan, which was sponsored by Senator Lindsey Graham, a Republican, a close Trump ally, and a close friend of Ukraine, would be to go after the Chinese, the Indians, and the Turks who are buying all Russian oil, and slap them with really huge fines if they continue to buy Russian oil, which would immediately stop them from buying Russian oil. And if they did that, then Russia would be out of business in 6 months' time. That piece of legislation, sponsored by Lindsey Graham, has 85 Senate co-sponsors out of 100 members of the Senate, which means it would pass the moment it was voted on, and it would be veto-proof. But that's not what these new sanctions are talking about. They're talking about something much more pinprick as opposed to overwhelming. And so, if there was any sincerity from the U.S. side about forcing Russia to come to the negotiating table, that would be the thing to do, which would be to sanction the buyers of the oil, so Russia no longer has that financial flow, which is the main financial flow which keeps the war going.
And just for context for our viewers, Lindsey Graham around 4 to 6 weeks ago said that he'd had confirmation from Donald Trump that he was willing to sign this bill once it hit his desk. But then, of course, yet again, it was stonewalled and it fell on deaf ears. We haven't heard anything about that. And then, of course, we saw in conjunction with that, Donald Trump exempting Hungary from further sanctions. So it really seems as if we're going in the opposite direction. But I mean, who's to say in the next few weeks we'll see Lindsey Graham circle back and say he's gotten Trump's approval yet again, and then we'll see Putin back on the negotiating table. But Bill, let's get into what is happening today. It is crunch time for European leaders. They will meet in Brussels to discuss at a summit to press Belgium to release tens of billions of euros worth of frozen Russian assets in order to provide Ukraine with the economic and military needs for the next 2 years. So Ukraine is effectively on the verge of running out of money. It is estimated that they will need 137 billion euros for 2026 and 2027, but the money needs to arrive by March, April time. So European Council Chairman Antonio Costa has vowed that they will retrieve this money, even if the summit takes days. Of course, we're heading into Christmas, so this really is crunch time. But this summit will determine Ukraine's fate, as you mentioned to me last week. So how significant is today?
Well, if the answer is that today is monumentally significant, but as it may not just be today, it may be today, tomorrow, the next day. The most important decision was made last week, which is that the Russian money that the Russian central bank reserves is no longer up for debate. It's permanently frozen until the end of the war. That's the crucial decision. Now, effectively, we have until March of next year to figure out how to get Ukraine the money they need to carry on. From that money, Belgium has made some demands to say that they don't want to be on the hook legally if Russia comes after them for that money. So, and they're not wrong to make that statement. I believe Europe has come up with a plan to basically give them comfort. They still aren't comfortable. We don't know what's happening behind closed doors with a negotiation. I suspect that there is actually something a lot more sinister going on, which is that somebody from Russia has personally threatened the prime minister of Belgium. That sounds like an outrageous statement, but we know from a report that came out last week that the head of Euroclear, where the money is actually being held, has had to hire security for the last year because she was threatened with death from Russia. It would seem very likely that, and I believe that there's a Guardian article yesterday saying that other officials have been threatened. And so it would seem to me that these people are not just talking about policy here, but they're talking about fear for their own personal safety. And so it's a very ugly situation. This is a mafia state we're dealing with. Russia is a mafia country. They kill people who stand in the way of their money. I read a good quote the other day, which is Russia doesn't count their dead, but they count their money. And so this is something, they're ready to kill over money. And so I suspect that there's a lot of really scared people right now because this is the decision that if they were to approve a massive loan to Ukraine, that keeps Ukraine in the game. That puts Putin in a really terrible position. And that also takes away the U.S.'s leverage to force a terrible deal on Ukraine. What is the U.S. leverage right now? The U.S. leverage is that Ukraine is running out of money because the U.S. has stopped supplying that money. If all of a sudden Putin is effectively supplying that money via a loan secured against his central bank reserves, then the U.S. can't tell Ukraine what to do at all. And if that's the case, Ukraine can then, hit oil refineries, hit shadow tanker oil fleet. They can do what they need to do, and they can continue to kill Russian troops who are pouring across the border and dying on a daily basis. And that there may be a moment when it's just too much. I don't think that Putin has got unlimited supply of money or people, particularly as Ukraine degrades Russian economic abilities with their drone attacks on different economic resources. And so this is truly a pivotal moment. I would have said that it was going to for sure be approved. And I was even saying that last week. That was until the Trump administration has started to interfere and tried to put pressure on Europe. And they have a bit of leverage on Europe that they can apply, which is they can threaten to withdraw NATO. They can threaten tariffs. They can do all sorts of nasty stuff to prevent this money from being released. And that's something which is very sinister. If it happens and it prevents the money from being released and Ukraine were to lose, that would lead to all sorts of terrible consequences for Ukraine and for Europe.
But I mean, that's incredibly contradictory to put pressure on these EU countries to not take this money out of Belgium when they've said from the start, look, the US doesn't want to pay for the war, find a way to pay for it. They found a way to pay for it.
Yeah, well, I mean, we all have eyes and ears and brains, and we've all seen that. It looks very sinister. And then it comes back to why would they do that? Why would they do that against the American national interest, against what Republicans want? Why would they do that? And it doesn't make sense on the surface, and so we have to look a little bit below the surface. And that article in the Wall Street Journal, I think, scratches that surface, the one about all the business deals that can be done by a small group of people.
Bill, here's what the Financial Times wrote about today's meeting. It said Belgium's Prime Minister will have to look Vladimir Zelenskyy in the eye today and tell him why he believes Russian state assets immobilized in Brussels should not be used to keep the Ukrainian president's war-torn country afloat. So Belgium makes hundreds of millions in tax revenues off these frozen Russian assets, but the tax receipts are supposed to be directed straight towards Ukraine, not kept for Belgium's own budget. Now, Belgium officials say that 100% of these tax revenue has gone towards Ukraine, but there has been speculation that this might not be true. Bill, I know you're not a conspiracy theorist, but this is an interesting take, and I've had a war correspondent in Ukraine say to me that this is why he believes that Brussels is holding this money, refuses to let it leave into the hands of Ukraine. What do you make of this?
I don't actually believe that. I think that it's much more base and sinister. And as I mentioned before, I think that the Russians have threatened personally the Prime Minister of Belgium, and he's scared for his own life.
What happens today, just as a final question, what happens today if Belgium refuses to give up the money, where does that leave Ukraine? But also, where does that leave financially EU countries?
Well, basically, if Ukraine doesn't have the money to carry on, they need to get that money to carry on. One of two things happens. If they don't get that money, then the front lines collapse. What happens if the front lines collapse? Russia pours across the borders in Ukraine further. What happens to the people of Ukraine? You end up with a massive refugee crisis. 20 million Ukrainians will pour into Europe. What happens next? Russia occupies a large part of Ukraine. And by the way, what do they get when they're occupying a large part of Ukraine? They get all the materials that we've supplied, all the equipment. They also get all the Ukrainian soldiers because they get forced, sort of frog marched into battle on behalf of Russia. And then we end up with a new front, perhaps at the Polish border or the Ukrainian or the Estonian or Latvian or Lithuanian border. And then what happens? Do we, as NATO allies to those countries, do Britain, do the rest of Europe then go to defend those countries? Do we go to war with Russia? Do we die fighting Russian troops? If so, then we end up having lots of British and European dead. If we don't, then we're back to 1930s Europe, where Russia then starts taking over countries through force. That's what happens. So that's a pretty dire set of outcomes. And so then the question is, if you want to avoid that, then you got to give Ukraine the money they need to buy the bullets to fight off the Russians. And if you do that, where does that money come from? It can either come from raising taxes, and we know how like different countries' governments are collapsing over taxes, or you can take the money from the Russian reserves. And so it's a very, very serious situation. And for Brussels to stand in the way and saying, well, they're not sure about this, they could basically be signing the death warrant for Europe in doing so.
So, Bill Browder, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Thank you.